So what if I told you the U.S. Congress is, well, deliberately hiding hundreds of billions in spending every single year?
Right.
Using these accounting tricks, really sophisticated ones, that mean most taxpayers, maybe even most legislators, they never see the true bill.
It almost sounds like a conspiracy theory, doesn't it? But when you actually look at the evidence, the sources you shared, it's kind of just the reality of Washington's budget process.
Yeah.
We see it all the time, this constant fiscal chaos, right? They keep failing to pass a real budget, rely on these short-term fixes like continuing resolutions, CRs.
Exactly. And that's what this deep dive is really about today, tailored for you. We're digging into these sources, focusing on, well, the conservative argument that Washington's suffering from a complete abdication of responsibility. That's the phrase they use. It's this whole environment where politicians seem to consistently choose, short-term political wins over actually managing this staggering $36.2 trillion national debt.
And the scale of that debt problem, it gets kind of hidden because Congress focuses all its energy in the wrong place.
Yeah.
They spend all this time fighting over this tiny slice of the pie.
Right. The discretionary spending is only about 30% of federal spending.
Yeah, just 30%. Meanwhile, the other 70%, that's the mandatory spending. We're talking Social Security, Medicare, plus those huge interest payments on the debt that just keep growing.
And that part's basically locked in, right? It just grows automatically year after year. Inflation, demographics, it's on autopilot.
Totally on autopilot.
Yeah.
So our mission today, looking at these sources, is really to pull back the curtain on these, well, clever, sometimes really obscure accounting tricks Congress uses.
Tricks to get around the few rules that do exist for that 30% discretionary part.
Exactly. And by doing that, they're making the debt problem worse, maybe exponentially worse, all while trying to create this, illusion of fiscal responsibility.
Okay, so let's unpack that. The structural failure. You're saying the few attempts to actually limit discretionary spending, which theoretically that should be the easiest part of the budget to control, they're just constantly and maybe deliberately undermined.
That's the core argument we found in the sources, yes.
Yeah.
You hear about spending caps, right? Like, remember the Fiscal Responsibility Act for FY 2024? It set a limit, $1.59 trillion.
I remember that. Seemed like a big deal.
When the sources show that number, that stated limit, it was largely, well, meaningless.
Meaningless. How so? And here's the number that really jumps out. Because of all these accounting tricks and budget gimmicks, the total discretionary spending authority they actually approved for FY 2024, it ended up being roughly 20% higher than that official limit.
20%? That's over $300 billion in spending.
Yeah.
Just kind of obscured from public view, hidden from critics in one single year.
$300 billion, that's huge. How are they hiding that much money? You said the mechanism is complex, but the motive is simple. Spend more, but don't look like you're spending more. Let's start with trick number one you mentioned, fake rescissions.
Okay, yeah. This one gets a bit technical, but it's key to understanding the shell game here. We need two terms, budgetary authority, BA. Think of that like the legal power to spend money, your authorized credit card limit.
Okay, BA is the limit.
Right. And then there's outlays, OT. That's the actual cash leaving the treasury.
Yeah.
That's the debt showing up on your credit card statement.
Got it. BA is the permission, OT is the actual spending. So how does a fake rescission work with those?
Well, a rescission is supposed to be a cut, right? You're canceling BA. But what Congress often does is they rescind BA that was authorized maybe years ago, stuff that was honestly never going to be spent anyway.
Like an old permission slip you never used.
Exactly. Like an old credit card limit from 10 years back you forgot about. It's technically there, an authorized liability, but there's zero chance it'll ever become actual debt. That's what the sources call phantom BA.
Ah, phantom BA. So they cancel this old unused authority and they claim, look, we saved money.
Precisely. And here's the trick. Canceling that phantom BA creates room under the spending cap. Looks like a cut. So they immediately fill that newly created space with new, real BA, stuff that will absolutely be spent, usually this year.
So they're swapping imaginary savings for real new spending, real new debt?
That's it. The sources point to this really egregious example in the Fiscal Responsibility Act itself. There was this non-recurring expenses fund. Sounds technical, right? It used $12.44 billion in this phantom BA, basically traded it in for $12.44 billion in real current year BA. So the net result, higher outlays, bigger deficits, all while they claim they made a budget cut.
Wow, it really is budget theater, isn't it? Using complicated terms to kind of pull the wool over people's eyes.
That's one big gimmick. But beyond these fake cuts, they also rely on, well, fake crises. Which brings us to gimmick number two, fake emergencies.
Okay, this one sounds maybe a little easier to grasp.
It is, mostly. Basically, any spending that gets designated as an emergency is automatically exempt from all the spending caps. No questions asked.
So they just slap an emergency label on things.
Congress abuses this, yeah. They arbitrarily label regular, ongoing, discretionary spending as emergency spending. Sometimes, according to the sources, it's part of these secret verbal side deals between party leaders.
Side deals.
Yep. And the sources specifically mentioned one, quote-unquote, emergency designation was for, wait for it, space exploration.
Space exploration. That doesn't sound like an unforeseen hurricane or something.
Hardly. It's clearly not a sudden disaster needing immediate uncapped relief. It's just a way to fund non-emergency pet projects without having to follow the budget rules.
That feels like a classic Washington loophole. Okay, and the third major gimmick, you said it targets that big 70% mandatory spending part we talked about earlier?
Correct. This is what the sources call mandatory loophole abuse. It's where lawmakers take things that are typically discretionary items, stuff that should be debated and funded each year through appropriations, and they move them into the mandatory spending category.
Why would they do that?
Because once it's mandatory, it's locked in. It becomes self-executing, grows automatically. We saw this in FY 2024, the sources say, with parts of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, IIJA, that included $116.62 billion in spending that relied heavily on deficit financing, moved into mandatory.
I remember hearing about the PASI-T Act for veterans and the CHIP Act for semiconductors being controversial in this budget context.
Right.
Were those examples too?
They were, yeah. Significant portions of the PASI-T Act for veterans health care and the CHIP Act funding were categorized as mandatory spending. Now look, supporting veterans and boosting domestic chip manufacturing, those are popular goals, right? But the conservative argument highlighted in these sources is that this maneuver permanently takes these huge expenses out of the yearly oversight process. You lose the discipline of the appropriations process. It guarantees their rapid growth no matter what the economy is.
Okay, that structural move is concerning. But let me just push back a bit here, play devil's advocate. If the PCT Act is funding health care for veterans exposed to toxins, isn't making that funding mandatory just? Ensuring those vital services are protected. You know, protecting them from being held hostage in political budget fights every single year.
That's definitely the counter-argument you hear, and it makes intuitive sense, absolutely. But from that fiscal haunt perspective in the sources, the moment you shift a large, growing program out of the discretionary debate and lock it into mandatory spending, well, you lose pretty much all leverage to ever reform it or trim it later if needed.
Oh.
It becomes almost impossible to adjust those spending levels if circumstances change. And that's why that 70% mandatory slice of the budget is where the debt crisis is really, truly accelerating. You lose control.
That connects the dots perfectly. So the accounting tricks let them spend more, but the political system keeps demanding more spending in the first place. Which brings us to the core incentive problem. Why? Why do lawmakers keep doing this, even when they know the debt is just astronomical?
Yeah, it really comes down to political incentives just overriding any sense of fiscal discipline. The core issue, according to the public choice theory mentioned in the sources, is this problem of concentrated benefits and dispersed costs.
Okay, break that down for us. Give us a clear analogy.
Okay, imagine some arguably wasteful federal program. Let's say it costs $300 million nationwide. Now, for the few companies or maybe special interest groups that get that money, maybe they're all in one particular congressperson's district, that benefit is huge, right? It's concentrated. They will fight tooth and nail to keep that program funded.
Okay, concentrated benefit for the few. What about the cost side?
For the average taxpayer, that $300 million program costs them, what, maybe less than $1 a year, spread across everyone. There's zero public outcry, no real incentive for them to call their congressperson and demand that specific program be cut. The cost is just too dispersed.
Right, I see. So the political math is easy for the lawmaker. They get intense, focused support from the few who benefit, and they face almost zero backlash from the general public who barely notice the cost. It's like a risk-free way to buy loyalty or campaign support.
And that dynamic naturally fuels what they call political log rolling or pork barrel politics. It's basically, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. Legislators trade votes, supporting each other's wasteful projects to get support for their own.
Makes it impossible to kill anything.
Nearly impossible, especially to eliminate programs that are outdated or just duplicative. The sources mentioned Washington currently runs something like 342 different federal economic development programs. Many overlap. But no single committee chair wants to be the one to say their program is the redundant one.
And The whole political environment, the media.
Yeah.
It doesn't exactly help those fighting for fiscal discipline, does it?
Not at all. The whole incentive structure seems to reward spending. You often see the media label politicians who agree on bipartisan deficit spending as moderate or reasonable.
While the ones fighting for actual cuts.
They get called extreme, radicals, deficit hawks, usually not in a complimentary way. This puts pressure on lawmakers to just keep the spending going, almost regardless of the economy or the national debt.
Okay, this really brings the recent fights over the continuing resolution, CR, that short-term funding bill, into sharper focus. From the perspective in these sources, why do hardline fiscal conservatives see opposing a CR, even risking a shutdown, as necessary leverage?
Well, from their viewpoint, CRs just kick the can down the road. They perpetuate the existing unsustainable spending levels already inflated by those gimmicks we talked about, the fake rescissions and emergencies.
So for them, a shutdown isn't the worst outcome.
For them, the threat of a shutdown isn't seen as a failure of governance. It's seen as necessary leverage. It's maybe the only leverage they feel they have to force structural spending reforms that otherwise would just never even get discussed.
And they often aim for a longer CR, right, to push past the end of the year?
Yeah, often they strategically aim for a long stopgap, one that runs into the next calendar year. The goal there is usually to prevent what's called a lame duck omnibus bill.
What's that?
That's a giant spending bill passed after an election, but before the new Congress takes over. They worry it locks in the previous administration's potentially higher spending levels for another full year.
Okay, so if the goal is this big course correction, what does a conservative budget actually look like in practice? What specific priorities get targeted for cuts?
We can get a good idea by looking at recent proposals, like the president's FY 2026 conservative budget blueprint mentioned in your sources. It really exemplifies this ideology. The headline is a call for pretty significant cuts to base non-defense discretionary spending.
How significant?
Specifically, a proposed 22.6% reduction below current levels. The idea is to restore fiscal discipline and do it immediately.
And these aren't just like across-the-board percentage cuts, are they? They seem to be targeting spending based on philosophy or ideology.
Exactly right. The core idea driving these cuts is that the federal government shouldn't be involved in, say, social engineering or heavily subsidizing choices that belong in the private market. The cuts specifically target programs the administration labels as ideological spending, or sometimes woke programs.
Can you give some concrete examples from the sources?
Sure. Things like canceling over $15 billion in funds earmarked for renewable energy projects, eliminating $5.7 billion meant for electric vehicle charger grants. The argument being, those are decisions for consumers and the private market, not taxpayer subsidies.
What about social programs or initiatives?
The blueprint proposes prohibiting federal funding for certain progressive nonprofits and also for diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI-focused workforce programs. Again, the argument is that these initiatives divert resources from what they see as core government functions.
And conversely, what areas are protected or increased in this kind of budget?
Core national responsibilities see increases. Defense spending is proposed for a 13% increase. Homeland Security gets prioritized, specifically citing border security and mass removal campaigns, and veterans' health care funding is protected. The focus is clearly on traditional government roles, defense, borders, veterans, while aiming to eliminate spending deemed outside that scope.
Okay, cutting discretionary spending seems like a focus, but as you said, the mandatory spending is 70% of the budget. It feels like trimming discretionary is necessary but not sufficient. Structural reform for the whole budget process seems like the only real path to stabilize the debt long term.
That's absolutely the consensus view among the fiscal conservatives cited in these sources. And the single biggest structural change they propose is replacing the current system, which is called pay-as-you-go, or PY-GO. It sounds sensible, but they argue it's flawed.
Okay, what does PY-GO actually do, and what's the replacement?
So PAY-GO basically requires that any new mandatory spending or any new tax cuts have to be offset, either by spending cuts somewhere else or by tax increases, so it doesn't add to the deficit on paper. The problem is Congress finds ways to waive it or game the system all the time.
So it doesn't really work in practice.
Often not. So conservatives propose replacing it with something called cut-as-you-go, or CUTGO.
CUTGO, how would that work differently?
CUTGO still requires new spending to be paid for, but crucially, it adds another layer. Any increase in the projected deficit from any cause must be addressed primarily by reducing spending, not increasing taxes. It structurally defaults the whole system towards spending restraint and deficit reduction being the primary goal.
Okay, so it forces the system towards cuts rather than just finding offsets. How would they make sure this discipline actually applies to that huge 70% mandatory spending part?
To make CUTGO really bite, they argue you need truly comprehensive budgeting. The entire budget process every year has to look at the totality of federal spending and revenue. And critically, it must include the massive unfunded trust fund deficits, think Social Security and Medicare shortfalls on the official enforcement scorecard. Right now, those future liabilities aren't really effectively counted against new spending decisions.
And what about stopping those specific gimmicks we talked about earlier, like the fake emergencies? Any structural fixes proposed for those?
Yes, specifically for emergency spending abuse. The proposal is to require Congress to create these sort of placeholder accounts when they declare an emergency and spend money. That emergency spending would then have to be offset with real cuts within, say, 3 to 5 years.
And if they don't offset it?
Then it would trigger automatic spending reductions through that new CTGO mechanism. It basically removes the free money aspect of just slapping an emergency label on something.
That makes sense. And finally, what about tackling that log rolling problem? Getting rid of those, 342 overlapping economic development programs. How do you overcome the politics where every member protects their own little piece?
They propose creating a government waste commission. And the model they point to is the base realignment and closing BRAC process, which was actually pretty successful in the past at closing hundreds of unneeded military bases, overcoming huge local opposition.
How did BRAC manage that? What's the key?
The absolute key requirement, and this would be crucial for a waste commission too, is that Congress must vote up or down on the entire package of proposed cuts and eliminations. No amendments allowed.
So no legislator can just go in and carve out their district's pet project from the list.
Exactly. They'd be forced to vote against billions and billions in overall savings just to protect their one small, potentially wasteful program. It makes opposing the whole reform package politically very difficult, almost toxic.
That's clever. It flips the incentive structure. It forces them to consider the collective good over those concentrated special interests.
Precisely. It aims to make the dispersed benefit of fiscal responsibility finally outweigh the concentrated benefit of wasteful spending.
Wow. Well, that was a really powerful deep dive into the arguments and mechanisms presented in your source material. I think the two key takeaways for me are really clear. First, the spending problem from this perspective is fundamentally structural, not just cyclical. And second, Congress uses these sophisticated, often deliberately hard to understand maneuvers, these fake rescissions, fake emergencies, to make the $36.2 trillion debt worse, all while trying to look fiscally responsible.
Yeah, and the stakes, according to these analyses, just couldn't be higher. The current path, adding trillions to the debt seemingly without end, is genuinely jeopardizing the country's economic future. We're essentially gambling our fiscal health on this hope that interest rates will just stay low forever, which is, well, a huge gamble.
Seems like it.
And the time for avoiding these difficult structural choices, these inconvenient choices, it feels like it's just running out.
So now you, the listener, know the mechanisms. You've heard about phantom BA, fake emergencies, and the proposed CUTGO alternative. Next time you see a big political fight erupt over a continuing resolution, or you hear politicians talking about spending caps, maybe ask yourself, is this fight really just about funding the government day to day? Or is it actually about protecting these loopholes, protecting the status quo, and avoiding the fundamental structural change that might be needed to stop this massive debt from crushing future generations?